I'm Jodi Throckmorton, Associate Curator at the San Jose Museum of Art, and I curated the exhibition This Kind of Bird Flies Backward, Paintings by Joan Brown at the San Jose Museum of Art. Joan Brown was a beloved Bay Area artist who got some really great attention very early in her career, at the early age of 22 actually. And she had a long career, 35 years of working in very different styles, starting with abstract expressionism and the Bay Area figuration that is known in the West Coast, and then working into a much flatter style of painting later on in her life. I think that Joan Brown is important because not only did she have success with these, with abstract expressionism and Bay Area figuration, but she went in her own direction. And she always did what spoke to her as a painter. And I think that's what makes her important. And she was also a trailblazer in terms of the women's movement and things like that. She wasn't necessarily talking the talk, but she was definitely walking the walk. She didn't rest on her laurels with the abstract success with her early work. She went into her own path and always did what felt true to her. So when I started thinking about the idea of curating this show, I started thinking about putting Joan's work within the context of the women's movement. She actually had a rather conflicted relationship with feminism. There's interviews where she talks about how she's not a feminist. She didn't identify with that type of movement that was going on in the late 60s and 70s. There's also things where later on she said, I wasn't necessarily a feminist, but I definitely believed in a lot of what they were doing. I look back and I see how my imagery maybe relates to that. And that was what brought my initial interest in her as a feminist, is this conflicted area. Because I started looking at the work and seeing how not only was she a trailblazer in the 50s and 60s, she had success in the abstract expressionist movement, which was heavily male. She had that success early on, sort of proving that she was a trailblazer, but also then she made this switch and went into this very personal subject matter that a lot of it, in terms of self-identity, in terms of the body, in terms of looking at her relationships with men, aligns directly with what the feminists were doing at the time. And that's where my interest in comparing her work to the women's movement all started. The theme of this show is looking at her work from the late 1950s to the late 80s, as the last painting of the show is 1985, looking at how that work does relate to what the women's movement was doing and feminist arts were doing. And that's, I tried to show, I think even early when she was painting these early self-portraits of herself, there was glimpses of that coming through. The show is arranged chronologically, so we're looking at a wide range of her work, but then I did pull out certain things. I pulled out the personal narratives. She was actually painting her son Noel, which was not something that a lot of male painters were doing at the time. She was painting domestic life, and then she was also painting about herself a lot. That was something that started in the late 1950s for her, looking at herself, much like the feminists were, not as this sexual object, but what it means to be a woman in a physical body and what that means to you. And then also looking at relationships between men and women, the power dynamics in a relationship. Joan had a very progressive approach to relationships in her life, and I think that's reflected in her work. And I think she was really a trailblazer in showing that on canvas. And then also the body, looking at what it means to be a woman and to be aging, looking at these different body parts and all those things that really a lot of feminists were doing, but most women associated with the feminist movement were working in video or performance, things that while Joan was, painting.
Can you give us a history of how Joan's work evolved?
Sure, I can give it a try. It's a big history. So Joan started her career as an artist really when she enrolled at the California School of Fine Arts. She didn't have any formal art training really before that. She had a minor interest, but no one really encouraged it. So it was really by chance that she enrolled at the California School of Fine Arts, which is now she was actually painting her son Noel, which was not something that a lot of male painters were doing at the time. She was painting domestic life. And then she was also painting about herself a lot. That was something that started in the late 1950s for her, looking at herself, much like the feminists were, not as this sexual object, but what it means to be a woman in a physical body and what that means to you. And then also looking at relationships between men and women, the power dynamics in a relationship. Joan had a very progressive approach to relationships in her life, and I think that's reflected in her work. And I think she was really a trailblazer in showing that on canvas. And then also the body, looking at what it means to be a woman and to be aging, looking at these different body parts and all those things that really a lot of feminists were doing, but most women associated with the feminist movement were working in video or performance, things that while Joan was, painting. This is all coming out of abstract expressionism, which was the major shift there. You know what I mean? Abstract expressionism was a big game changer for everybody when people were working abstractly. And it was this whole, we could get really deep into this, and I'm not sure how deep we should go. For people who aren't familiar with Joan's work or are familiar with what was going on in the 1970s at that time, there were a lot of artists working in this bad painting style, is what it was called actually. And there was a famous exhibition at the New Museum that was all featured of these artists that were being purposefully bad painters. And it was that idea of coming off of this very expressionistic style, very abstract style and abstract expressionism, but not turning necessarily, it was about personal expression, not necessarily about skill. And it's not to say that none of these artists probably couldn't paint that well, because many of them could have, and Joan did, different experiments throughout her life with form and paint. But it was a style that was going on at the time as like a direct response almost to abstract expressionism, which same as minimalism. You think of minimalism, that was a response to that too. And it was in a lot of ways, you see the gesture in Joan's paint, but that's also why she switched. One of the reasons, I hypothesize that she switched from that really gestural brushstroke that you see in the earlier work, the really thickly painted work, to these more flat things. It's like it's removing that gesture that was so common with abstract expressionism. But it was definitely a new frontier. And once again, just like with the feminists, I don't think she was necessarily politically motivated to join this, bad painting movement, but it's something that her work is often included in. Yeah, bad in quotes is what it is, So Joan emerged as an artist, all these things going on, abstract expressionism, Bay Area figuration, but there was also the element of the beat generation going on in San Francisco, which was quite the time with poets, and there was this underground gallery scene that Joan participated in. At the time, she was making sort of funky art with fur and cardboard. So she really got into this scene where they were not motivated by the art market, which I think is something you see come up again and again in Joan's career. She wasn't motivated by selling art. It was this compulsion to create that she really did, the reason she did it for. And so I think that's where the influence of the beats really hit her the most, is that they created art not necessarily for it to last for 100 years. They created it for themselves and for the moment. And Joan lived in this notorious apartment on Fillmore Street, I think on Fillmore Street, and with Wally Hedrick and Jay DeFeo, who Jay and Joan were very close. Two very important painters, and Joan lived there with her first husband. And they actually notoriously put a hole through the walls in the apartments and opened the apartments up so that there was more free-flowing party atmosphere going on. So that was definitely, the beat generation was the beat movement was very instrumental in Brown's development, I would say. Well, it was really in the mid to late 60s where we see the big change in her work. The 70s is characterized by more of what we loved about Joan, is this very personal expression of her work. Some people have called her work diaristic, which I would completely agree with. Nothing was off limits. She painted her affairs. One of the reasons that I think that she's important now is because I think that her brand of feminism, if we could call it that, appeals to a lot of young artists right now, especially some young women artists right now. It is a conflicted relationship with feminism, whether you label yourself as a woman painter or not. And I think that's where we see her relevance still today. She didn't necessarily have problems being labeled a woman painter. She just wanted it to be considered that there were other things too that she could be labeled as. It was like, there's a great quote where she says, you know, she's not just a mother, she's not just a wife, she's not just a painter, she's everything. And that's how Joan, I think, wanted to be considered. It was more about how she fit in the whole scope of things rather than in one category. Something that I learned while doing this exhibition, and it sounds a little cliche, but I think it's a really important message that Joan Brown's work sends and her life sends, is to follow what you think is right and follow what you think you need to do. I mean, the critics trashed her for a lot of this work, especially after she made that change, because she was sort of the media darling, you know, in the 50s and 60s with this work, but it wasn't speaking to her. And so she did her own thing, and I think that's something that all artists who are working nowadays, which it's really hard, you know, to make your way in the art world, it's something to follow, it's something to look up to. I do think that Brown deserves to be recognized nationally, and she is. There are little patches where she has been recognized, but I definitely believe that she needs more of recognition in the United States. And I hope by this show, by putting her within this context of the women's movement, showing what she was doing at this time, showing that she was involved in some ways with dealing with this imagery, it helps, because she has been left out of many of the feminist shows that have been done recently. And I hope by showing that, you know, she was engaging with the subject matter of the time, that it helps her reputation nationally. Mm-hmm.